Well, touted as Europe's Trump whisperer, Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni has held a face-to-face meeting with the US President at the White House as she tried to strike a deal for the EU on tariffs. But there was a big turning point moment, in my view, with far and wide-ranging significance. And that was when Giorgia Meloni called on Trump to form an historic alliance for the West. Have a look.
When I speak about West, mainly I don't speak about a geographical space. I speak about a civilization. The goal for me is to make the West great again, okay? And I think we can do it together.
Now, clearly, this is not just about Italy. Giorgia Meloni is fighting for the West and for the survival of Western civilization. And Donald Trump is the only Western leader with a spine to actually get there. Joining me now is Sky News contributor Beau Davidson. Beau, good to see you. Thank you so much for joining me. Is this the leadership the world needs? Meloni and Trump side by side seeking to revive the West?
Yes, Danica, I think it's needed absolutely to preserve civilization. You know, we hear all this talk about nationalism like it's a bad thing, but I really think it's much more than nationalism. It's about exceptionalism, Western exceptionalism. That's how you preserve civilization, Western civilization. And I think you have to dare to be exceptional. And I thought about this word dare and how it can be an acronym. And think about D, democracy, preserving the institution of democracy, how important that is. We have to fight for that. A, audacity, being a bold and courageous leader, fighting for what's right, fighting for what's good. And then, of course, you have R, responsibility. Responsibility to be moral, to be a civil society, our customs, our traditions, our values, our culture. Those are all important things too. And then finally, E, economy. Economically, you know, obviously, ideally, we want to have fair and free trade, obviously, but we also want to be self-reliant. And that's important when we're talking about tariffs and things like that in terms of China and other parts of the world. So I think if you think about that word dare as an acronym, I think it's important to dare to be exceptional. What I see between Meloni and Trump happening right now is very important for the world. It's not just those two. It needs to be other people that stand up and dare to be exceptional, because if we don't, I think we do lose Western civilization as we know it.
Yes, look, I absolutely agree with you, definitely. Now, look, let's talk about Trump tariffs. He's not backing down despite the economy on quite shaky ground worldwide. What has been the reaction over there, particularly from business in America?
Well, I think it's been unsteady. I think there's a lot of somewhat of an insecurity. But at the same time, Danica, you have to remember, and for those of your audience that are watching, especially in Australia, I actually encountered 2 Australians last week, and they did not want to talk about tariffs. It's important to do this because you have to stand up to China. You mentioned he's not backing down. You know, Tom Petty, I won't back down. That song, I think, represents his presidency, and especially with reactions to these tariffs. You know, he understands the Chinese mindset. If you look at his book, The Art of the Deal, he talks about this, how he understands the Chinese mentality. And, you know, they're cutthroat. That's how they are as business people. So what happens is when you go into a situation with China, you have to be able to play ball. You have to play hard. And I think what's happening right now, when you think about 75 nations or more coming to the table to renegotiate with Trump, here's why it's important. You can ban some of those transshipments that China has had for many, many years. And that's why it's important, not just for the two nations to talk about their own tariffs internally, but also how to ice out China economically. So sure, here in the U.S., there's some uncertainty. I won't lie about that. But I think maybe by summer of next year, at latest, we'll see. The market, of course, is going to be volatile. That's, of course, true. But I think ultimately what we could perhaps get to is a place where tariffs could essentially replace the income tax. That would be music to a lot of Americans' ears. So what we consider to be short-term pain is probably better for long-term gain. And here's what else it does. It puts the Chinese in the crosshairs. And I'm talking about their intellectual property theft. I'm talking about economically, trade-wise, what they're doing, the Wuhan flu hound. All of that is because China has ripped us off and ripped the world off for many, many years. And it's time to put the focus on them and realize they can't get away with this anymore. So here in America, I think we've got some unsettledness, but I think we're getting somewhere finally. First president to stand up to them.
Well, yeah, look, it is an America First policy, and I guess that is what he was elected on, so I can understand it from that perspective. Now, look, let's move on, because Joe Biden's attempt to bill $300,000 per speaking appearance is finding few takers. Who would have thought, especially after this shocker this week?
And I'd never seen hardly any black people in Scranton at the time and I was only going in 4th grade. And I remember seeing the kids going by at the time called colored kids on a bus going by.
Beau, seriously, who would want to pay $300,000 for an incoherent, dribbling rant?
Well, first of all, Danica, he's alive. He's alive. Here we are at Easter. Usually we talk about Jesus Christ's resurrection off the cross, but thank God Joe Biden is actually alive. He's alive and kicking. I got to tell you, Danica, I don't think his speeches command $300, much less $300,000, especially when you make comments like you just played. I think it's safe to say that he's not going to be speaking at the NAACP or any historically black colleges and universities anytime in the near future. It's an unforced error. But shame on CAA, the creative artists agency, for signing him and Kamala Harris, two of the worst speakers imaginable right now. I think what this also shows to Danica is his narcissism. He's a narcissistic money grubber. And I hate to say that about a former president, but he doesn't know when to quit. He didn't get out when the getting was good. He's out there making speeches that nobody wants to hear. And nobody wants to hear about corn pop and the white hair on your legs that happens after you get in the pool with kids. Nobody wants to hear that. So to Joe Biden, I say, we've talked about this many times, Danica, it's time for you to give up entirely. No one's going to pay this amount of money for your speeches because nobody wants to hear you speak.
Yeah, I wouldn't even want to hear him speak for free at this point when you hear that sort of nonsense. Beau Davidson, good to speak with you. Thank you so much for your time this evening.
Oh, my pleasure, Danica, always.